A German couple set out for a romantic climbing adventure in the Swiss Alps, but they encountered a brutal accident and only one returned, barely alive and forever changed by what happened on that frozen peak. For 2 decades, Petra Kreuger's family accepted she was lost to the mountain's cruel embrace. Then climate change triggered a catastrophic avalanche that exposed secrets the glacier had been hiding and led investigators to uncover evidence of something unthinkable. The heavy oak door of the Alpengasthof Edelweiss was not designed to be opened gently, but it had never been thrown open with such desperate, freezing force. On that late August evening in 2002, the blast of wind that tore through the cozy lodge was sharp enough to snuff out candles, carrying with it a flurry of snow and a man who looked more like an apparition than a guest. He didn't walk in so much as collapse over the threshold, a ragged shape of blue and orange against the warm wood of the entryway. The half-dozen patrons and the lodge owner, a stout man named Klaus, froze, their quiet conversations and clinking glasses silenced by the raw sight of him. This was Stefan Fischer, or what was left of him. His face was a ghastly mask of windburn and frostbite, his lips cracked and blue, his beard caked with ice. His gloveless hands were swollen and waxy, a telltale sign of severe exposure. He stumbled forward a few steps, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated, his high-tech mountaineering gear looking battered and abused. He tried to speak, but the only sound that escaped his throat was a dry, rattling gasp. He was 31 years old, but looked decades older, aged by an ordeal etched into every line on his frozen face. Klaus was the first to react, rushing forward and grabbing the man before he could fall. "Mein Gott," he muttered, feeling the bone-deep cold radiating from Stefan's body even through the thick jacket. He and another guest half-carried, half-dragged the trembling man to the large stone fireplace that dominated the room. They peeled away his stiff outer layers while the owner's wife hurried over with thick wool blankets and a steaming mug of tea, which Stefan was physically unable to hold. As warmth began to seep back into him, his shivering intensified into violent, uncontrollable spasms. And through the chattering of his teeth, he finally managed to form words. They were not for himself. They were for someone else. "Petra!" he choked out, his eyes wide and vacant, staring past the concerned faces into the fire. "Petra, she's gone." The local gendarmerie were summoned from the nearby village. 2 officers, accustomed to dealing with lost hikers and minor skiing accidents, arrived to find a scene of controlled urgency. Stefan, now wrapped in layers of blankets and having been tended to by a local doctor who confirmed severe frostbite and exhaustion, was coherent enough to give his account. Sitting at a heavy wooden table, his bandaged hands resting uselessly in his lap, he recounted the events of the past few days. His voice was hoarse, hollowed out by grief and the biting alpine air. He told them everything. He and his girlfriend, 28-year-old Petra Kreuger, were experienced climbers. This trip to the Alps was supposed to be a highlight of their summer, a challenging but rewarding ascent. They had been making good time, the weather holding beautifully, until it didn't. High on a glacial plateau, the sky had turned on them with shocking speed. A serene blue morning had devolved into a blinding whiteout. He described the snow not as falling, but as a horizontal, malevolent force, erasing the sky, the ground, and the space between. Visibility dropped to mere feet. They were roped together, moving cautiously, when the ground beneath Petra simply vanished. Stefan's voice cracked as he described the sickening lurch of the rope, the weight of her body suddenly gone. He'd been pulled forward, scrambling for purchase on the ice, but she was gone. He screamed her name into the howling wind, the sound swallowed by the storm. He crawled to the edge of the hole she'd disappeared into, a deep, dark blue maw in the white expanse, a crevasse hidden by a fresh layer of snow. He called and called, his voice raw, but the only answer was the shriek of the wind. There was no sound from below, no cry for help, nothing. He knew he couldn't go down after her, it would have been suicide. The storm was now a full-blown blizzard. His only chance, he explained, was to survive. He'd used his ice axe to dig a desperate snow cave, a coffin-sized shelter against the wind, and huddled inside for what he thought was 2 days, drifting in and out of consciousness, his food gone, his hope dwindling with every passing hour. When a brief break in the weather finally came, he stumbled his way down the mountain, a grueling, half-lucid journey back to civilization. The officers listened intently, their faces grim. The story was terrifying, but tragically, it was not an unfamiliar one in these mountains. Everything about Stefan's condition, the frostbite, the dehydration, the clear psychological trauma, corroborated his harrowing tale. There was no reason to doubt him. This was the brutal reality of the Alps. Before the night was over, an official missing person report was filed for Petra Kreuger. A full-scale search and rescue operation was mobilized to begin at first light. And in a quiet, sterile office, one of the officers made the most difficult call of all. Miles away, in a peaceful German suburb, the phone rang in the Kreuger household. Petra's sister, Simona, answered, her world about to be irrevocably fractured by the news that her sister had been taken by the ice. At the first hint of dawn, the air at the base of the Alps was filled with a purposeful, mechanical hum. The search and rescue operation for Petra Kreuger launched with the full force of Alpine protocol. A state-of-the-art helicopter, its rotors slicing through the thin, frigid air, lifted off from a makeshift landing zone, carrying a team of seasoned rescuers. These were men who understood the mountain not as a picturesque postcard, but as a living, breathing entity with an unforgiving nature. They were dressed in bright, functional gear, their faces set with a grim professionalism that spoke of countless similar missions, some successful, many not. The search area was vast and treacherous. From the air, the glacial plateau that Stefan had described was a chaotic seascape of frozen waves, a blinding expanse of white, fissured with countless dark blue lines, crevasses. Each one was a potential tomb. The conditions on the ground were just as Stefan had reported. A fresh, deep layer of snow blanketed everything, masking the landscape's true dangers. It was unstable, prone to shifting, and made every step a calculated risk. The search teams that were deployed on the ground moved with painstaking slowness, probing the snow ahead of them with long poles, their breath pluming in the cold. The mountain was actively working against them. For 2 days, the search yielded nothing. The teams focused on the quadrant Stefan had indicated, a grueling grid search in punishingly low temperatures. They were looking for any sign at all. A scrap of fabric, a discarded piece of equipment, a glove, anything that would narrow the search from miles to feet. But the blizzard had been brutally efficient, wiping the slate clean. The mountain held its secrets tightly. The mood at the base camp, initially crackling with the energy of the rescue effort, began to sober into a quiet, gnawing dread. It was on the 3rd day that an unexpected communication arrived, not from the mountain, but from the outside world. An email landed in the inbox of the local gendarmerie. It was from a German couple, Heinrich and Greta Schmidt, who had been vacationing in the area the previous week. They had seen a brief news report about the missing climber, and the name Petra Kreuger had struck a chord. They attached a digital photograph to the email. The authorities opened the file. There, on the screen, was the image of a vibrant, smiling couple, framed against the very same majestic peaks the rescuers were now scouring. On the left, a woman with dark blonde hair and a bright smile, wearing a distinctive pink and purple jacket. On the right, a man with a red beanie, his arm around her, raising an ice axe in a gesture of pure joy. It was Petra Kreuger and Stefan Fischer. In their email, the Schmidts explained the context. They were amateur photographers and had been hiking near a trailhead when they crossed paths with the young couple. They had exchanged pleasantries, remarking on the perfect weather. Stefan and Petra had been so full of life and excitement that Heinrich had offered to take their picture with his new digital camera. It was a fleeting, happy moment. 2 sets of strangers connecting briefly over a shared love for the mountains. They had exchanged email addresses, promising to send the photo along. Now they were sending it to the police with their deepest condolences and prayers. The photograph was a gut punch to the investigators. It was a poignant timestamp of the last moments of normalcy, a ghost from just a few hours before the tragedy. It was immediately invaluable. It confirmed the exact clothing and gear they were wearing, details that could be crucial for spotters. But more than that, it served as a stark, heartbreaking reminder of what was lost. A copy was printed and pinned to the operations board at the base camp, a silent testament to the mission's purpose. Meanwhile, Stefan, against medical advice, refused to remain idle. His hands were heavily bandaged, his face still raw from the frostbite, but a fire burned in his eyes. He insisted he could help. He couldn't join the teams on the ground, but he was taken up in the helicopter. From the air, hovering over the terrifyingly uniform landscape, he pointed downwards, his bandaged hand trembling. "There," he said, his voice strained. "The terrain looks right. I think it was one of those." He indicated a cluster of large crevasses, his memory blurred by trauma and the disorienting whiteout. His grief was palpable, his desperation to find her raw and convincing. The rescuers took his information, focusing their efforts on the specific crevasses he'd highlighted, but the landscape had been altered by the storm, and certainty was a luxury no one had. Soon after, a small rental car pulled into the lodge's parking lot. A woman emerged, her movements stiff with anxiety. It was Simona Kreuger. She had driven through the night, a frantic, sleepless journey fueled by a terrible hope. She was the mirror image of her sister in the photograph, but her face was etched with a fear that was the polar opposite of Petra's joyful expression. She immediately sought out the lead rescuer, her questions tumbling out. Had they found anything? Was it possible she survived the fall? Petra was strong, she explained. She was an experienced climber. She had her pack, her gear. She could have made a shelter. Simona's presence added a new layer of human tragedy to the procedural operation. She would sit in the lodge for hours, her gaze fixed on the mountain, a mug of untouched coffee growing cold in her hands. She and Stefan spoke in hushed, pained tones. They were united in their vigil, two people bound by their love for Petra, waiting for a miracle from a mountain that rarely gave them. But the miracle never came. After 8 days of relentless searching, the operation reached its inevitable conclusion. The lead rescuer, a man with weathered skin and sorrowful eyes, assembled his team. They had explored the crevasses Stefan had pointed out, lowering cameras hundreds of feet into the blue-black ice. They had found nothing. The weather was turning again, with another storm front moving in, making any further ground search prohibitively dangerous. A formal meeting was held in the lodge. The lead rescuer laid out the facts to Simona and Stefan, his tone gentle but firm. They had exhausted all viable options. The probability of survival after this much time, given the fall and the subsequent extreme temperatures, was 0. To continue the search would be to needlessly risk the lives of his men. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The search for Petra Kreuger was officially being called off. Simona let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp, her last sliver of hope extinguished. Stefan sat motionless, his head bowed, his bandaged hands clenched into fists in his lap. The official report would state that Petra was presumed dead, her body tragically irrecoverable, entombed somewhere within the vast, indifferent glacier. The case was closed. The mountain had claimed her, and it was not giving her back. In the months and years that followed the tragedy, the sharp edges of grief began to dull for the outside world, settling into the soft focus of memory. The story of Petra Kreuger became a cautionary tale whispered among alpine enthusiasts, a somber reminder of the mountain's supremacy. For Stefan Fischer, the physical recovery was a slow, painful process. The frostbite had cost him the tips of 2 fingers on his left hand, a permanent physical reminder of his ordeal. For a long time he was a haunted figure, his trauma worn like a second skin. He moved away from the mountains, settling in a city far from any snow-capped peaks, and threw himself into his career as an architect. He rarely spoke of Petra or the accident, and friends learned not to ask. It was a closed chapter, a vault of pain that he seemed determined to keep locked. Slowly, life began to reassemble itself around him. He met someone new, a kind woman who knew of his tragic past and treated it with a delicate respect. To everyone who knew him, Stefan Fischer was a survivor, a man who had stared into the abyss and had, by some miracle, clawed his way back. But for Simona Kreuger, time did not heal. It calcified. The official narrative of a tragic accident was a story she heard but never truly absorbed. In the quiet solitude of her apartment, the case of her sister's disappearance remained wide open. Grief had sharpened her mind into a forensic tool. She had requested and received a copy of the official incident report, and she read it over and over until the pages grew soft with handling. She had the maps from the search, the weather reports from those fateful days, and a printed copy of Stefan's official statement. And one detail, one seemingly small piece of the narrative, began to snag in her mind, pulling at the fabric of the entire story. It was the rope. Stefan had been clear in his account. They were roped together for safety on the glacier. This was standard, non-negotiable procedure for any experienced climbers. A safety line connects two people, ensuring that if one slips, the other can act as an anchor. Simona, who had climbed with Petra many times, knew this intimately. She replayed the scenario in her head 1,000 times. If Petra, weighing over 130 pounds with her gear, had suddenly plunged into a crevasse, the force on that rope would have been immense and violent. It wouldn't have been a gentle tug. It would have been a catastrophic pull, powerful enough to rip Stefan off his feet, to drag him across the ice toward the same abyss. At best, he would have been left with deep rope burns, a dislocated shoulder, or severe bruising around his harness. At worst, he would have been pulled in with her. Yet, in his statement, Stefan described being pulled forward and managing to scramble for purchase. His injuries, while severe, were all related to exposure and frostbite. There was no mention in the medical report of any injuries consistent with arresting a major fall. How had he unclipped himself from the rope, from his falling partner, in the middle of a blinding blizzard, without sustaining any of the expected trauma? This question began as a whisper in Simona's mind and grew into a roar. It was a detail that didn't fit, a gear that wouldn't mesh in the clockwork of the official story. She started making calls. Her first was to an old friend of Petra's, an expert alpine guide. She laid out the question hypothetically, without mentioning Stefan's name. The guide was unequivocal. "It's nearly impossible," he'd said. "To arrest a fall like that, you have to throw yourself to the ice, dig in with your axe, your crampons, everything you have. It's a violent, desperate act. You don't just scramble for purchase. The rope is your lifeline, but it's also a potential anchor dragging you to your death. He'd have injuries to show for it." Armed with this, Simona tried to bring her concerns to the authorities. She wrote letters to the gendarmerie, who had handled the case, laying out her logic in careful, precise detail. The responses were always polite, sympathetic, and dismissive. An officer explained in a patient tone that in the chaos of a storm and the trauma of the event, memories become unreliable. Perhaps the rope had snapped on a sharp edge of ice. Perhaps Stefan, in his panicked state, had misremembered the exact sequence of events. They reminded her that his physical condition was proof of a genuine life-or-death struggle on the mountain. Her questions were noted, they assured her, but with no body and no new evidence, the case remained closed. They treated her as what they believed she was, a grieving sister unable to accept the senselessness of a random accident, looking for patterns in the chaos. Her persistence became a source of quiet friction within her own family. Her parents, devastated by their loss, had accepted the official conclusion. They found Simona's quiet investigation morbid, a refusal to let Petra rest in peace. They saw Stefan as a fellow victim, a young man who had loved their daughter and had almost died with her. Simona's gnawing doubt was something she was forced to carry alone. Years turned into a decade, then two. The file on Petra Kreuger was moved from a filing cabinet to a box, and from the box to a deep storage archive in the basement of the police station. It was officially a cold case, but not one that anyone ever expected to thaw. In 2021, 19 years after Petra vanished, the lead investigator on the original case, a man named Kurt Beyer, retired. During a small farewell gathering, a junior officer asked him about the cases that stuck with him over his long career. Beyer, a man of few words, stared into his beer for a long moment before answering. He mentioned a few unsolved burglaries, a hit and run, and then he paused. "The Kreuger girl," he said, his voice low. "The one lost on the glacier back in 2002. The junior officer was surprised. "But that was an accident, wasn't it? Tragic, but straightforward?" Beyer took a slow sip. "On paper, yes. But the sister, she used to call every year for a while. She was sharp. She had a question about the rope that we never could answer to anyone's satisfaction." "Not really?" He shrugged as if to dismiss it. "Probably nothing." In the mountains, strange things happen, but it was a loose end, always felt like a loose end. He left it at that, a fleeting comment born from a professional hunch he could never prove. It was the last time Petra Kreuger's name would be officially mentioned for a long time. The file remained in its box, buried under 2 decades of other people's tragedies, waiting for the mountain itself to offer up a new and far more terrifying piece of evidence. For 20 years, the glacier held its secret. It moved with the silent, imperceptible power of geological time, a river of ice flowing downhill at a rate of mere inches per day. The place where Petra Kreuger had vanished was buried under season after season of new snow, which compacted into dense layers of fern, and then, finally, into the crystalline blue of glacial ice. Her tomb was sealed, moving slowly but inexorably toward the mountain's lower reaches. The world changed, technology evolved, people aged, but the ice remained, a perfect frozen capsule of a moment of terror. Then came the autumn of 2022. It was a season of anomalies. A prolonged, brutally hot summer across Europe had been followed by an autumn that refused to yield to the cold. Record-breaking temperatures persisted into October, a time when the high Alps should have been receiving their first heavy snows. Instead, the sun beat down on the glaciers with an unnatural intensity. The ice, which had been in a slow retreat for decades due to climate change, began to melt at an accelerated, alarming rate. The conditions created a perfect storm for instability. The meltwater seeped deep into the fissures and cracks of the glacier, lubricating the ancient ice from within. High on a remote face of the mountain range, a different face entirely, miles away from the quadrant searched so desperately in 2002, the breaking point was reached. It began with a deep groaning crack that echoed through the empty valleys like a thunderclap. Then, with a terrifying roar, a massive section of the glacier broke free. It was not a simple avalanche of snow, it was a catastrophic collapse of the ice itself. Millions of tons of ice, rock, and debris, a section of the mountain that had been stable for centuries, let go. It cascaded down the slope in a churning, grinding wave, scouring the mountainside down to the bedrock. The event was so immense it registered on seismographs in the region, a geologic spasm that permanently redrew the maps of that part of the range. When the dust and ice crystals finally settled, a new landscape had been born, raw and exposed, the mountain's ancient blue heart laid bare for the first time in human history. Weeks later, a lone figure was making his way across this newly altered terrain. He was a ski mountaineer named Leo, a local man who sought the solitude and challenge of exploring the Alps' most remote corners. He was drawn to the site of the avalanche, fascinated by the raw power of the event and the opportunity to ski on terrain no one had ever touched. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew the mountains, his skis gliding over the scarred, uneven surface of what remained of the glacier's base. The scene was surreal. It was a boneyard of ice, with colossal, house-sized seracs of ancient blue ice jutting out at odd angles, interspersed with fields of rubble and rock. It was in this alien landscape that Leo spotted it. From a distance, it was just a splash of incongruous color against the overwhelming palette of blue, white, and gray. It was a flash of something bright, something that didn't belong. Pink and purple. Curiosity piqued, he angled his skis toward the object, navigating around a large block of ice. As he drew closer, the colors resolved into what was clearly fabric, tattered and frayed, emerging from the edge of a melting sheet of ice. He stopped, planting his poles, and a prickle of unease ran down his spine. This was not a recently discarded piece of litter. This was old, weathered, and it was attached to something. He knelt down, his skis sinking slightly into the soft, sun-cupped ice. He reached out a gloved hand and gently brushed away some of the surface slush. The fabric was part of a jacket sleeve, and emerging from the sleeve was the unmistakable, pale curve of bone. Leo recoiled, his heart hammering in his chest. He looked more closely, his eyes scanning the area around the fabric. His breath caught in his throat. Just a few feet away, lying partially submerged in a meltwater pool atop the ice, was a human skull. It was bleached and weathered, but largely intact. As he stared, mesmerized and horrified, he saw more. Other bones, ribs, and vertebrae were scattered nearby, melting out of their icy prison. It was a scattered partial skeleton being offered up by the thawing glacier. Then he saw the boot. It was a single mountaineering boot, heavy and leather, of a slightly older style. A yellow-strapped crampon was still attached to its sole, its metal spikes looking menacing even while at rest. The boot lay on its side, as if it had been tossed aside. Leo knew immediately what he had found. The mountain was giving back one of its lost souls. His training kicked in. He didn't touch anything else. He pulled out his phone, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline. He noted his exact location, taking several photos of the scene from different angles, capturing the position of the skull, the fabric, and the boot relative to each other. The gravity of the discovery was immense. He was standing at a grave, one that had been hidden for years, and he was its first witness. With the evidence documented on his phone, he carefully backed away, his mind racing. His solitary adventure had just intersected with someone else's long-finished tragedy. He turned his skis downhill and began the descent. The image of the skull and the bright pink fabric burned into his mind. He had to tell someone. He had to report what the mountain had revealed. The call from the ski mountaineer sent a jolt through the regional gendarmerie. The discovery of human remains in the high Alps was not an everyday occurrence, but neither was it unheard of. The mountains held many secrets, and melting glaciers had been surrendering the bodies of climbers lost decades ago with increasing frequency. The initial response was procedural, almost routine. A team was assembled, comprising forensic specialists and members of the Alpine Police Unit, officers who were as comfortable on a vertical ice wall as they were in an office. The helicopter ride to the coordinates Leo provided was tense. The sheer scale of the avalanche's devastation was breathtaking, a testament to the mountain's raw power. The team landed as close as they could, then made the final approach on foot, their boots crunching on the alien terrain of ice and rock. Leo was there, having agreed to guide them, and he pointed to the spot, his face pale. The scene was exactly as he had described, a grim tableau set against the stunning backdrop of the Alps. The forensic team immediately went to work, establishing a perimeter. Every movement was slow and deliberate. This was not just a recovery, it was an archaeological excavation of a modern tragedy. They photographed everything, documenting the precise location and orientation of each bone, each scrap of clothing, before anything was touched. The air was thin and cold, and the only sounds were the clicking of cameras, the quiet murmur of professional instructions, and the distant drip of melting ice. The pink and purple fabric was the first clear identifier. An officer who had been a junior constable in the region for years felt a flicker of recognition. He was too young to have worked the original case, but he had heard the stories. "Kreuger," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "The girl from '02. A quick check of the cold case database back at headquarters confirmed his hunch. The clothing was a match for the jacket worn by Petra Kreuger in the last known photograph of her. As the team carefully worked to excavate the remains from the ice, a somber sense of purpose settled over them. They were finally bringing Petra home. The scattered nature of the bones was consistent with 2 decades of glacial movement and the recent violent avalanche. Her body had been broken apart by the immense, grinding pressure of the ice over time. They collected every fragment they could find, placing each piece into sterile evidence bags. The boot with the crampon was catalogued and bagged separately. After hours of meticulous work, they had recovered what was left of Petra Kreuger. The news was delivered to Simona Kreuger in person. 2 plainclothes officers arrived at her door, their expressions gentle. When they told her that Petra's remains had been found, Simona felt a complex wave of emotions wash over her. There was the sharp, renewed pain of loss, but beneath it, a profound, soul-deep sense of relief. For 20 years, her sister had been lost in a nameless, frozen tomb. Now she had been found. There could be a burial, a headstone, a place to mourn. The uncertainty that had haunted her for half her life was finally over. But that sense of closure would prove to be cruelly fleeting. The remains were transported to the Regional Forensic Institute for examination by the chief pathologist, Dr. Elise Brandt. Dr. Brandt was a meticulous, no-nonsense professional who had seen everything the mountains could do to a human body. She began her work expecting to document the fractures and trauma consistent with a long fall into a crevasse, followed by 2 decades of being crushed within a glacier. She laid out the bone fragments on the stainless steel examination table. The first thing she noted was the skull. It was remarkably well preserved in some respects, yet horrifically damaged in others. As she began her detailed examination, a deep frown creased her brow. Something was wrong. The damage wasn't random. Falls, even catastrophic ones, tended to produce certain types of injuries. Massive compression fractures, radiating fracture lines from a single, major point of impact. The damage to Petra's skull was different. Dr. Brandt identified multiple distinct points of trauma. There were several small, almost circular puncture wounds that had pierced the cranium, concentrated on the top and back of the skull. Alongside these punctures were larger, shattered areas, as if the bone had been crushed inwards by repeated focused blows. She picked up a magnifying lens, her focus intensifying. These were not the chaotic injuries of a body tumbling into an icy chasm. This was patterned, targeted violence. The puncture wounds, in particular, were chillingly regular. They looked like someone had tried to drive a spike through the bone. She cross-referenced the damage with her extensive database of trauma injuries. It didn't match falls. It didn't match rock falls. It looked like an assault. Dr. Brandt paused her examination and walked over to a separate table where the evidence recovered from the scene was laid out. She looked at the tattered clothing, the worn backpack, and then her eyes fell on the boot and its attached crampon. She stared at the sharp steel spikes, 12 points designed to bite into solid ice. She returned to the skull, her mind racing. She took a sterile caliper and measured the diameter of one of the puncture wounds. Then she went back and measured the diameter of a crampon spike. The numbers were a near-perfect match. A cold dread washed over her. She now understood the pattern of violence. The puncture wounds were from the sharp points of the crampon. The crushing injuries were from the frame of the crampon being stomped or slammed down with immense force. Petra Kreuger had not died in an accidental fall. She had been bludgeoned to death, and the murder weapon was the most basic and essential piece of mountaineering equipment. Dr. Brandt picked up her phone and made a call that would change everything. "This isn't an accident," she told the lead investigator on the new case. "This is a homicide." The revelation sent shockwaves through the department. The dusty, 2-decade-old file on Petra Kreuger was reopened with a new, terrifying urgency. The lead investigator, a sharp, intuitive detective named Thomas Ziegler, immediately focused on the evidence. He pulled up the crime scene photos Leo had taken, alongside the official forensic shots. He stared at the boot, and then he pulled up the file from 2002, clicking on the digital photo sent by the German tourists. He placed the images side by side on his monitor. On the left, a smiling Stefan Fischer, his feet clad in heavy mountaineering boots with distinctive yellow straps on the crampons. On the right, the single boot found miles away with Petra's remains, its yellow strap faded but unmistakable. It was the same make, the same model. But there was more. He looked at the sizing information logged by the forensic team. The boot was a European size 45. It was a man's boot. It was Stefan's size. It could not have been Petra's. A horrifying new theory began to form, a narrative far darker than a simple accident. The location of the body, miles from where Stefan claimed the accident, happened. The nature of the injuries. And now the presence of a boot that could only belong to Stefan, found right alongside her remains. It suggested a confrontation, an attack, and a killer who had somehow lost a piece of his own equipment in the violent struggle or its aftermath. The mountain hadn't just given up a body, it had preserved a crime scene, and it was pointing directly at one man. The forensic pathologist's report landed on Detective Thomas Ziegler's desk with the force of an indictment. The words homicide, blunt force trauma, and patterned injuries consistent with a weaponized crampon transformed a 2-decade-old tragedy into an active murder investigation. The file on Petra Kreuger, once a dusty relic of a presumed accident, was now the center of a storm of activity. There was no question about the primary and only person of interest, Stefan Fischer. Ziegler was a man who trusted process. He began by building a timeline, laying out the facts of 2002 against the stark new reality of 2022. The discrepancies were glaring. The location of the body was the most damning inconsistency. Glaciers move, but not in the way Stefan would need them to. Ziegler consulted with a team of glaciologists who confirmed that for Petra's body to end up at the discovery site, she would have had to fall into a crevasse on a completely different part of the mountain range, miles away from where the official 2002 search had been concentrated based on Stefan's own testimony. He had sent the rescuers on a wild goose chase. The question was, why? The answer seemed terrifyingly obvious: to ensure Petra was never found. The investigation into Stefan Fischer began discreetly at first. Ziegler's team needed to know who he was now, not who he was 20 years ago. They discovered he was a successful architect, a partner in a prestigious firm in Hamburg, hundreds of miles from the Alps. He was well respected, living in a minimalist modern house with his long-term girlfriend, a landscape designer named Anya. He was, by all outward appearances, a man who had successfully compartmentalized his past, a pillar of his community. Ziegler knew he had to tread carefully. He needed more than just a theory and a 20-year-old boot. He needed something to tie Stefan Fischer, the 51-year-old architect, to the events of 2002. He needed the other crampon. It was a long shot. Most people wouldn't keep 2-decade-old mountaineering gear. But climbers were often sentimental about their equipment, especially gear that had been with them on significant life-altering trips. Working with the Hamburg police, Ziegler's team obtained a search warrant. It was a broad warrant covering Stefan's home, his office, and, crucially, a storage unit registered in his name at his parents' former address in a nearby suburb. The raid was coordinated to happen simultaneously. While detectives arrived at Stefan's sleek, glass-walled office, another team, led by Ziegler himself, approached the unassuming roll-up door of a suburban storage facility. The search of Stefan's home and office yielded nothing, but in the storage unit, amidst neatly stacked boxes of architectural drawings, old furniture, and forgotten household items, they found it. Tucked away in the back corner was a large, heavy-duty duffel bag caked with a thin layer of dust. Inside was a collection of old mountaineering equipment, ice axes, carabiners, faded climbing rope, and a pair of worn leather boots. And attached to one of those boots was a single, yellow-strapped crampon. It was the mate to the one found on the glacier. The crampon was carefully bagged and sent express to the Forensic Institute. The team there was looking for something specific, something that could only be seen under a powerful microscope. They examined the 12 steel points of the crampon one by one. On 3 of the spikes, they found what they were looking for: microscopic stress fractures and infinitesimal flecks of metallic chipping embedded within the surface. A forensic metallurgist was brought in. His conclusion was chilling. The damage was not consistent with the typical scraping and scratching of climbing on rock and ice. This was damage caused by repeated high-velocity impacts against a surface that had some give but was ultimately hard, a surface like human bone. When compared with the chips found on the matching crampon from the crime scene, the evidence became a matched set, not just in make and model, but in the very story of violence their metallic structures told. It was time to talk to Stefan Fischer. The confrontation took place in a sterile interview room in a Hamburg police station. Stefan had been brought in under the guise of needing to clarify some details about the new findings in Petra's case. He walked in with the calm, slightly weary air of a man who has long grown accustomed to being associated with a tragedy. He sat down opposite Ziegler, his hands folded calmly on the table. Ziegler began gently, recapping the discovery of the remains, expressing his condolences. Stefan nodded, his face a mask of somber acceptance. Then Ziegler slid a large, glossy photograph across the table. It was a close-up of Petra's skull, the patterned puncture wounds clearly visible. Dr. Brandt, our pathologist, found these injuries, Ziegler said, his voice neutral. She says they are not consistent with a fall. Stefan stared at the photo. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Not shock, not grief, but something else. The glacier, the avalanche. It must have happened then, he said, his voice steady. The rocks, the ice. Ziegler let the silence hang in the air before pushing a second photo across the table. It was the boot and crampon lying on the ice where it was found. We found this near her body, Ziegler said. Our experts have identified it as a man's boot, size 45. Your size, Herr Fischer. Stefan's composure began to crack. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Many people wear those boots. It's a popular brand. Indeed, Ziegler agreed, but then we found this. He placed a clear evidence bag on the table. Inside was the other crampon, the one from his storage unit. This was in a bag with your old gear. It's the matching crampon. Stefan stared at the bag. He seemed to shrink in his chair. The color drained from his face. The location where she was found is miles from where you said the accident occurred, Ziegler continued, his voice hardening. The glaciologists say it's impossible for the ice to have moved her that far. Her injuries were not from a fall. And your equipment was found at the scene. You told us you were roped together. How did you survive her fall without a single injury from the rope? How did your boot end up next to her body? How did her skull end up with holes that match your crampons? The questions came one after another, a relentless barrage of logic and evidence, dismantling the 2-decade-old story piece by piece. Stefan Fischer was no longer a grieving survivor. He was a suspect in a murder investigation, cornered by the ghost of a crime he thought the mountain had buried forever. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at the crampon in the bag, the story he had told for 20 years dissolving into nothing. The interrogation room felt airless. Stefan Fischer sat in silence, the weight of 20 years of deception pressing down on him. His carefully constructed world, built upon a foundation of a single, tragic lie, was crumbling under the glare of the fluorescent lights. Yet he did not confess. After a long, tense silence, he uttered 2 words: "My lawyer." The interview was terminated immediately. But for Detective Ziegler and the prosecution team, Stefan's silence was as damning as a confession. They were convinced they had their man. The evidence, though circumstantial, painted a cohesive and horrifying picture. They began to assemble the case they would take to court, a narrative built from forensic science, geology, and the quiet, persistent doubts that had haunted Simona Kreuger for 2 decades. The prosecutors knew it would not be an easy fight. A conviction would hinge on their ability to persuade a jury to believe a story that had no living witnesses besides the accused. The defense would be formidable. They would argue that the passage of 20 years made any forensic conclusion unreliable. They would hire their own experts, glaciologists, to testify about the unpredictable and powerful forces of a shifting glacier, metallurgists to claim the damage to the crampons was inconclusive and could easily have been caused by normal use. They would paint Stefan Fischer as a victim, a man who had suffered an unimaginable tragedy and was now being re-traumatized by a prosecution team building a fantasy out of ambiguous evidence. Reasonable doubt would be their mantra. To counter this, Ziegler's team had to dig deeper. They needed a motive. Why would a young man, seemingly in love with his girlfriend, commit such a brutal act on a remote mountaintop? The question sent investigators back in time, re-interviewing the friends and acquaintances of Petra and Stefan from 2002. At first, people were reluctant to speak ill of the past. The couple had been remembered as vibrant, happy, a perfect match. But as investigators gently probed, armed with the new knowledge that this was a homicide investigation, cracks began to appear in that idyllic image. A former colleague of Petra's recalled a conversation in the weeks leading up to the Alpine trip. Petra had been uncharacteristically subdued. She had confessed that things with Stefan had become intense. He was talking about marriage and settling down, but she felt suffocated. She had admitted in confidence that she was thinking of ending the relationship. She had hoped the trip to the Alps, a return to the activity that had first brought them together, would either fix things or give her the clarity she needed to leave. Another friend from their climbing club remembered Stefan's temperament. He was charming and charismatic, but he had a possessive streak. He described an incident months before the trip where Stefan had gotten into a heated public argument with a man who was harmlessly flirting with Petra at a party. The friend described Stefan's anger as going from 0 to 100, a sudden, shocking flash of rage that was as quickly suppressed as it appeared. A motive began to solidify, one as old as time: jealousy and control. The prosecution theorized that the final confrontation had happened on that glacial plateau. Perhaps Petra had chosen that moment, in the stark beauty of the Alps, to tell Stefan it was over. An argument erupted. In the thin air, with emotions running high, his temper had flared. The ensuing violence was not premeditated, they argued, but a spontaneous explosion of rage. He had used what was at hand, or rather, on his feet. He had attacked her, and in the struggle, his own boot had come off. He had then concocted the story of the crevasse, a plausible lie in an environment where accidents were common. He had directed the search party to the wrong location, confident the mountain would keep his secret forever. His frostbite, his harrowing tale of survival. It was all real, but it was the result of his own desperate, panicked escape after committing murder, not an accident. The circumstantial case was strong, a web of interconnected evidence. The location, the injuries, the weapon, the motive. It all pointed to Stefan. But the lack of a confession or a direct witness meant the reasonable doubt argument loomed large. The prosecutors and Ziegler's team debated their next steps. They could arrest him now and risk a difficult trial, or they could continue to build their case, hoping to find one more piece of evidence, one more witness from the past that would make his conviction a certainty. They decided to wait, to tighten the net, believing time was on their side. They placed Stefan under discreet but constant surveillance. They were confident he was trapped. They underestimated his desperation. The pressure on Stefan Fischer was immense and invisible. While he walked free, he was a prisoner of the investigation. He knew he was being watched. He saw the unmarked cars parked down the street from his home, the same unfamiliar faces appearing at the coffee shop near his office. His lawyer had been blunt. The circumstantial case was dangerously compelling. While they could fight it in court, the outcome was far from certain. The forensic evidence of the skull, combined with the discovery of his own equipment at the scene, created a narrative that a jury would find difficult to ignore. An acquittal was possible, but so was a life sentence. Stefan was living on a knife's edge, the ghost of Petra Kreuger, closer than she had been in 20 years. He and his girlfriend, Anya, became increasingly reclusive. The curtains of their modern glass-walled house were kept drawn. Friends who called found their invitations politely but firmly declined. To the outside world, it looked like a couple buckling under the strain of a reopened wound. In reality, it was a period of frantic, secret planning. The prosecution, still meticulously building its case and preparing for the complexities of a trial based on 20-year-old evidence, believed they had him contained. They were in the process of securing the final expert reports and scheduling grand jury presentations. They felt the arrest was weeks, not days, away. This methodical pace, born of a desire for an unassailable case, created a small window of opportunity. It was a window Stefan Fischer intended to leap through. One Thursday morning, the surveillance team noted nothing out of the ordinary. Anya left the house for work. Stefan's car remained in the driveway. It wasn't until late the next day that the alarm bells began to ring. A junior detective reviewing routine financial flags noticed a series of massive electronic fund transfers. Stefan's personal and business accounts had been systematically emptied over the past 48 hours, the money wired through a complex chain of international banks. Simultaneously, another agent discovered that the sale of their house, which had been quietly on the market for a month, had closed 3 days prior. Panic set in. Ziegler's team descended on the house, this time with a newly issued arrest warrant in hand. They breached the door to find a home that was eerily empty. It wasn't just vacant, it was sterile. There were no clothes in the closets, no food in the refrigerator, no personal effects whatsoever. Even the indentations in the carpet where furniture had once stood were fading. They had been gone for at least a day. A frantic, large-scale manhunt was launched. Airport and border alerts were issued, but it was too late. Investigators quickly uncovered the couple's escape route. Using secondary passports they had acquired months earlier, Stefan and Anya had driven to a neighboring country. From there, they had boarded a flight, not from a major international hub, but a smaller regional airport. Their destination was a major transit hub in Southeast Asia, a place known for its labyrinthine cities and porous borders. And from there, the trail went cold. They had vanished, dissolving into the teeming anonymity of a continent. For Simona Kreuger, the news was the final devastating blow. The discovery of her sister's body had brought a sliver of peace, the promise of justice. Now that promise was snatched away. Stefan's flight was a confession in its own right, a clear admission of guilt in the court of public opinion. But it was not the justice she had waited 2 decades for. There would be no trial, no verdict, no moment of accountability where the world would formally acknowledge what he had done to her sister.